A wooden ash box sat in a basement room at Blodget's Hotel in Washington, D.C. It was the early hours of December 15, 1836. Nearby, firewood had been stored for the patent office. By morning, one of the most important archives in early American history was gone. Not a battlefield, not a riot, not a foreign raid. A government archive in the Capitol holding the record of American invention burned in the dark while the country slept. The physical traces of decades of ingenuity were reduced to ash in a single night. And what survived after that was not the whole story. It was whatever could be found, whatever could be resubmitted, whatever had not already vanished into private drawers, attics, workshops, and family papers. Today, the surviving fragments sit in the National Archives under Record Group 241, Restored Patents, with the restored series identified as NAID 305885. The patents in that collection carry an X after their numbers because they belong to the world before the modern numbering system. They are the remains of a lost federal memory. This matters because the familiar story says American innovation rose naturally, continuously, and safely into the modern era. But the archive says something colder. The nation that celebrates invention lost the documentary foundation of its first generation of inventors, and most of it never came back. The official version is not difficult to summarize, and it deserves to be stated fairly. The patent office was housed in Blodget's Hotel. Hot ashes ignited nearby stored firewood. The fire spread. Around 10,000 patent drawings or documents and about 7,000 patent models were lost. Congress later authorized reconstruction. Some records were restored. The system continued. That is the version most people would accept if they heard this story at all. A tragic fire, a regrettable loss, administrative recovery, national progress resumed. That was the version I assumed too, until one detail made the whole story look different. The government did not simply lose a building, it lost the federal record of nearly the entire pre-1836 patent era. And when I began reading the National Archives Guide, the USPTO history of the lost X patents, and the annual reports of Commissioner Henry L. Ellsworth, the pattern became difficult to ignore. The archive was not restored in full. It was partially reconstructed from whatever inventors themselves still possessed. The result was not recovery. It was selection by survival.
That single distinction changes everything, because once you understand that the patent office did not preserve its own memory, you stop looking at the fire as a closed event and start looking at it as a filter. Every inventor whose records remained in federal custody was vulnerable. Every inventor who lacked duplicate papers was vulnerable. Every invention whose drawings and specifications lived in only one official place was vulnerable. The fire was one night. The erasure took years. To understand what was actually lost, you have to step back into the structure of the early American patent system. From 1790 to 1836, U.S. patents were not yet part of the numbered sequence people assume today. The Patent Act of 1836 reorganized the system, established the Patent Office as a separate organization within the Department of State, and gave the Commissioner custody of the office's books, records, papers, models, machines, and related materials. In other words, the federal state was finally beginning to professionalize the archive of invention just months before that archive burned. That timing is one of the darkest ironies in the entire story. In 1836, the patent system was being modernized. Examination standards were becoming more rigorous. Records of past inventions were becoming more important, not less important, because the government needed a usable history of prior art in order to judge future claims. And then, within months, the government lost the very records it had just made essential to its own functioning. The archive burned at the exact moment the system began to depend on it. The familiar version of the story treats the recovery as proof that the damage was temporary. But the record does not support that comfort. The Patent Act of 1837, cited by the National Archives as 5 Stat 191, authorized a reconstruction process. Patentees could send in their original letter's patent, certified copies, or newly prepared documents sworn to match the originals. That sounds orderly until you follow its implication. The archive could only be rebuilt if inventors still had their own papers, or if someone else did. If they did not, the federal record simply ended.
This is where the number that matters most enters the story. Official summaries vary slightly in their shorthand. The USPTO says some 2,800 patents could be reconstructed. The National Archives and Princeton's Guide give the more specific figure of 2,845 restored patents. Either way, the conclusion is the same. More than 7,000 of those pre-fire patent records were never recovered. The safest wording is also the most devastating. The federal government lost the records and models for nearly 10,000 early American patents, and more than 7,000 of those records were never reconstructed. A nation can lose its memory without losing its machinery. That is what makes this story larger than a fire. It was not merely destruction, it was asymmetrical survival. Some records could come back because an inventor or a family or a local repository still had a copy. Others were gone because the federal archive had been the only archive that mattered. When the Reconstruction began, the government was no longer recovering a complete history. It was recovering whatever private chance had spared. The first hard layer of evidence is therefore the event itself. The National Archives states that around 10,000 patent drawings and around 7,000 patent models were lost in the fire. The USPTO similarly describes the destruction of the specifications and scale models for nearly 10,000 patents. That is not fringe material. That is the government and the archival record describing their own loss. The second layer is the Reconstruction Law. The archive did not quietly reappear. Congress had to act. The Patent Act of 1837 acknowledged that the old records were gone and established the legal path by which inventors could help rebuild them. Again, that matters because it proves that the state itself recognized the depth of the loss. There was no hidden backup waiting to be opened. There was a public mechanism for scavenging a destroyed archive back into partial existence.
The third layer is the money, and administrative records often reveal what public memory tries to smooth over. In the 1837 annual report, Commissioner Henry L. Ellsworth wrote that 2,000 patents have been restored and recorded anew since January. He also recorded that restoration payments for models, records, and drawings consumed by the fire had reached $10,705.15. By 1841, the restoration expenditures listed under the 1837 Act had reached $20,507.70. Those figures matter because they show the government spending money year after year on a repair job that still never restored the archive in full. Money continued. Completeness never returned. And before going further, I want to be careful about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming the 1836 fire has been proven to be a deliberate arson attack ordered by a corporate rival, a financier, or a covert faction inside government. The verified record does not establish that. What it does establish is that the federal government kept irreplaceable invention records and models in a vulnerable setting, lost them, and replaced only a minority of them through a process that depended on private survival outside official custody. If that is not the same as intentional suppression, it is still a documented mechanism by which history was narrowed. That clarification actually strengthens the argument, because the strongest counterargument is obvious. This was an accident, not a conspiracy. It was a fire, not a plot. The patent system was being professionalized in 1836, not dismantled,
and Congress acted to reconstruct what it could. All of that is true, but the counterargument fails to resolve the deeper issue. Even if the fire was accidental, the result was still a massive, permanent distortion of the documentary record of early American invention. A record can be erased by malice. It can also be erased by negligence. For the historian, the effect is often the same. What makes that distortion visible now is the surviving residue. Some records were reconstructed and can still be seen. Eli Whitney's cotton gin patent survives as 72X. The National Archives identifies it directly in the restored patent series. So do records for inventors who are no longer household names, like John Cotton, whose carriage worked by hand survives as 576X, and Chauncey Hall, whose diving dress survives as 1405X. That surviving group is not just evidence of what remained, it is a constant reminder of everything that did not. When the archive burns, the official story shrinks to whatever survives.
The human center of this story is not only the anonymous inventor whose records never came back, it is also the man who had to stand inside the wreckage and admit what the government had failed to protect. Henry L. Ellsworth became Commissioner of Patents on July 6, 1836, only months before the fire. The USPTO's own biography of Ellsworth says that the December blaze destroyed all the records, models, and papers of the Patent Office. He had barely taken charge of the modernized system before it disintegrated in his hands. Ellsworth is important because he is not a later commentator. He is a near contemporaneous institutional witness. In the aftermath, he was the one writing annual reports, accounting for expenditures, describing progress, and trying to restore an archive that no longer existed in complete form. He was also the person forced to decide, in effect, what counted as restored memory and what would remain lost. A bureaucracy had failed. One man had to narrate the damage. And then, in the middle of his administrative language, a human grief breaks through. In the 1837 annual report, Ellsworth wrote, "Among the losses occasioned by the fire, most deeply regretted was the destruction of all the papers deposited by Robert Fulton." He added that Fulton's drawings had been executed by his own hand. All his papers were gone. That single sentence carries more emotional weight than pages of abstract analysis. Robert Fulton was not a vague symbol. He was one of the most recognizable inventors associated with the early republic's mechanical ambition. And Ellsworth did not speak about him in generic terms. He emphasized the physical intimacy of the archive, Fulton's own hand. That is what burned. Not just a filing reference, not just a bureaucratic notation, the actual working trace of an inventor whose papers had become part of the government's custody and then vanished there. There is an almost unbearable irony in what happened next, and it reaches into the present. According to Smithsonian reporting, two original Fulton patent papers from 1809 and 1811 were later identified at the U.S. Naval Academy Museum. That means the archive the federal government believed it had lost was not entirely destroyed. Parts of it survived outside the federal system that was supposed to guard it. The state lost what other institutions or families or later custodians sometimes managed to preserve. This is the point where the suppressor has to be named with precision, because vague anger is cheap and imprecise anger does not hold. There is no verified evidence here that a shadowy financier ordered the blaze. There is no verified evidence that an industrial dynasty paid to erase specific patents. The real suppressor in this story is more ordinary and more dangerous than that. It is the federal archival system itself in the form it took in 1836. Unsafe custody, poor fire protection, concentrated vulnerability, and then, after the destruction, a reconstruction regime that could only restore whatever private chance had left behind. That is how it was done, not by publishing a decree that said certain inventors would be erased, by creating conditions in which only a fragment of the archive could survive a single point of failure, by leaving the nation's documentary memory of invention inside a vulnerable building, by forcing recovery to depend on who still had copies and who did not, by turning federal memory into a lottery of private preservation. That mechanism is documented, and once you see it, the usual language of accident starts to feel too small. The government did not need to decide whose memory mattered after the fire. Survival decided for it. Once you frame the story that way, the numbers begin to read differently. About 2,845 restored patents is often presented as evidence of successful recovery, but the more revealing number is everything outside that figure. More than 7,000 pre-1836 patent records remained unreconstructed. We do not know, case by case, what all of them contained. We do not know which lines of practical knowledge were fully duplicated elsewhere, which were partially known, and which were effectively severed from the federal record forever. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the argument. It is the argument. The archive broke, and thousands of early inventions fell through it.
This is why the surviving X patents feel so strange when you look at them. They are not simply old patents. They are survivors of an administrative catastrophe. Eli Whitney's 72X is not only evidence of invention, it is evidence of rescue. The same is true for John Cotton's 576X and Chauncey Hall's 1405X. Each reconstructed drawing is two histories at once, the history of an invention and the history of a near erasure. And the longer pattern only deepens the case. In 1877, the Patent Office suffered another major fire. A historical account says about 87,000 models and roughly 600,000 photolithographic drawing copies were destroyed, but 211,243 original drawings in 777 folios were saved. That contrast matters. By 1877, the institution had learned enough to preserve critical originals even as enormous losses still occurred. The second fire did not erase patent history in the same way because the system had become more redundant. Which means 1836 was not simply an unavoidable feature of the age, it was an exposure of how unprotected the earlier archive had really been. A bureaucracy remembers what it bothers to protect. That sentence may sound severe, but the later history of patent models makes it difficult to soften. The Smithsonian's National Museum of American History states that the Patent Office rescinded the model requirement in 1880, citing fire hazard and limited space. In other words, the government itself eventually admitted that maintaining huge physical model collections carried structural risk. The model room remained open for a while, public interest waned, and the system moved on. Then came disposal. In 1908, the Smithsonian began taking in patent models. In 1926, Congress passed a bill to dispose of the Patent Office's remaining models, with the Smithsonian keeping about 10,000. Hagley Museum and Library adds that the broader collection was gradually dispersed by the Commerce Department. Some models went to descendants, some to the Smithsonian, and others were sold at auction. This is not the same event as 1836, and it should not be treated as the same event. But it reveals something consistent. The physical memory of American invention was repeatedly shaped by administrative decisions about storage, hazard, space, and disposal, rather than by any stable national commitment to preservation.
That is the pattern. Fire, partial rescue, disposal, fragmentation, rediscovery. Not one event, a system. And once it becomes a system, the story stops being about old paper and starts being about power. Because what the state failed to preserve in 1836 was not just a few famous documents, it was a map of early American ingenuity. It was evidence of what inventors were solving, building, patenting, and imagining in the first decades of the Republic. It was the chain of comparison by which later generations could trace development, continuity, influence, and disappearance. When that chain breaks, historians do not simply lose artifacts, they lose context. This is where the pattern widens beyond one blaze in one building. The 1836 fire exposed a federal system that concentrated memory in one vulnerable place. The 1877 fire exposed the continued risk of maintaining vast physical collections. The 1880 end of the model requirement admitted those risks. The later dispersal of models across institutions, families, and auctions converted national history into scattered remnants. Every single one of those stages passed through official hands. Every single one changed what future generations could easily know. That is why this story still matters to you now, not because you were personally searching for an 1830s diving suit or a hand-worked carriage. It matters because the public record you inherit is never identical to the reality that once existed. It is the remainder after accident, storage policy, institutional priorities, and budgetary choices have done their work. When you read a clean national story about invention, you are often reading past the fact that the archive underneath it was damaged, filtered, and only partially restored. The present tense bridge is not abstract, it is practical. The early American patent record remains a reconstruction project, not a complete memory. The National Archives has digitized RG 241 restored patents, and the USPTO says that X patents continue to be identified and added through modern searchable systems like Patent Public Search. That means the nation is still, in effect, searching for pieces of its own lost inventive past. The work is ongoing because the loss was never fully repaired.
That has a direct consequence for how authority works in your own life. Institutions do not only control policy, they control retrieval. They control what is easy to find, what is cataloged, what is cross-referenced, what is digitized, and what remains effectively invisible until a historian or archivist or lucky family descendant stumbles across it. In the Fulton case, original patent papers turned up at the U.S. Naval Academy Museum long after the Federal Archive had written them into the history of loss. If that can happen with Robert Fulton, it can happen with lesser-known inventors whose names no one remembers to search. A missing archive does not only hide the past, it trains the future to think the past was smaller than it was. That is the most unsettling part of this story. We do not know exactly what disappeared with the more than 7,000 unreconstructed patents, and any script that pretends otherwise would be slipping from history into fantasy. But we do know enough to understand the scale of the distortion. We know the fire happened. We know the numbers were enormous. We know Congress had to authorize reconstruction. We know Ellsworth was still spending public money years later trying to rebuild what had burned. We know only a minority was restored. And we know parts of the supposedly lost archive can still surface outside federal custody, meaning the official record of loss is itself incomplete. That is not the language of conspiracy, it is the language of documented incompleteness. And documented incompleteness may be even more corrosive because it is easier to live with. A nation can acknowledge a disaster and still quietly accept the narrowing of its memory. It can digitize the survivors and forget the scale of the dead. It can celebrate innovation while building its own history on a partial file. If you want one image that captures the whole pattern, it may not be the night of the first fire at all. It may be the later image preserved by the Smithsonian, an amorphous mass of re-solidified brass and bronze from parts of patent models destroyed in the 1877 fire. Metal once shaped into demonstration models, form lost, function unreadable, evidence present, meaning absent. That is what a damaged archive looks like. Not always absence, often survival in a form that can no longer fully speak.
And so the question left by 1836 is not whether a fire occurred. It did. The question is what a country loses when the government fails to preserve the first rough draft of its own ingenuity. The records that remain tell us early America was inventive. The missing records suggest the story was larger than the one we inherited. More than 7,000 early patent records never came back. The unanswered question is how much of American invention history disappeared with them, and how much of what you call the official story is simply the story of what survived.